Welcome to California in Focus. I'm Aliana Kernodle. It's now been 1 month since the fires. California faces a budget crisis and may need federal aid to make ends meet after the fire if it's not willing to cut state spending elsewhere. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Trupp. Kenneth, how are the federal relief efforts looking?
Well, Newsom just got back on a trip from D.C. He went to ask Trump and Congress for money. As you know, Congress is dominated by Republicans, and Trump would need to sign a relief bill. So he needs Republican support if he's going to get the money he needs to bail out the state, because honestly, the state just doesn't have a lot of money on hand. It's going to have to spend $7 billion from reserves to make ends meet this year, and the budget is over $320 billion in state spending. If Newsom is not willing to make cuts somewhere, then he is going to have to get money from the federal government to help rebuild some of the state. However, right upon his return, Newsom signed these so-called Trump-proofing bills. He called a special session of the state legislature to really pass these two Trump-proofing bills that would create two legal funds to sue the Trump administration or to engage in lawsuits that support the deportation defense of illegal immigrants. Number one is a $25 million bucket for state and local officials for defense or affirmative lawsuits against the Trump administration. The second is a bucket of $25 million that's mostly for deportation defense, although there is some money for other indigent persons. Indigent just means someone who is very low income and unable to take care of themselves. This bill was signed by Newsom right upon his return from DC, which could possibly suggest things did not go as well as he expected. Maybe he doesn't want to give in to Republican conditions for aid. President Trump has called for conditions on California wildfire aid. The first is that he wants forest management. And the second is he's talked about including some kind of voter ID requirement. This would be controversial because California as a state just banned voter ID requirements. One city, Huntington Beach, did pass a voter ID requirement of its own that was upheld in court. Until this new law has passed, this matter will now be adjudicated because the law takes away essentially charter cities' abilities to oversee their own internal elections. So we'll see how that goes. But at the federal level, if a law is passed, that could supersede the state law. Number two is, I think that the California legislative analysts' report on wildfire policy does seem to suggest that, yes, policy is responsible for worsening blazes. Their report said that fires are getting worse over time, but burning less acreage. And that this is the result of focusing on wildfire suppression. So we spend a lot of money, billions of dollars, on stopping fires as soon as they start. We don't do any so-called fuels reduction or brush removal, which means that we're letting this deadly tinder build up into fires that are extremely severe. They note how California's forests are actually supposed to burn, have low and moderate wildfires every few years, but that these high severity fires are completely obliterating the forests. So this policy is not really working out for anyone. It seems that some forest management is the solution here if we don't just want to have uncontrolled burns on a frequent basis. Another thing to look out for is the insurance situation. California's insurer of last resort, the FAIR plan, just got approval for a $1 billion assessment on private insurers and their customers who are still operating in the state. One story we've been covering here at the Center Square is people having trouble getting insurance because so many insurance companies are leaving because of a 1980s state proposition that meant the state had to approve any rate increases for home insurance. But of course, home insurance rates have not kept up with claims, which means that insurers are just losing money. There have been a lot of rate approvals that have gone through, and there are some changes to the modeling and pricing that would allow them to rapidly raise prices. But in the interim, it just means that there is a funding shortfall for even the state insurer of last resort and for even these private carriers.
What is the impact of the fires on state and local governments?
Well, they're set to lose quite a lot of money from lost property value and also from a pause. This is going to affect all of the funding in the state for schools, most likely, because Southern California property tax revenue, that's a lot of money. The state-funded nonpartisan legislative analyst office says that just in LA County, the fires caused about a $10 to $20 billion reduction in assessed values, which is about $100 to $200 million in lost property tax revenues. And that money would have really gone to the county and city of Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles is, quote, broke, according to the city controller. So they don't have money. This would be a huge loss for them. And the cities of Pasadena and Sierra Madre and those school districts and special districts. This is compounded, though, by a pause in property tax payments in 18 fire-affected zip codes, which means that this affects about $200 billion in assessed value, which means that there will be a delay in payments of about $2 billion for state and local governments from this pause. And that could have huge implications for a budget, which, as we mentioned earlier, is already so precarious in the first place. So if you combine this with potential federal funding losses from non-compliance with federal laws or executive orders, as is possibly being considered under sanctuary state and city rules, property tax reductions and deferred payments would put a lot of pressure on budgets that are already strained by wildfire response.
What actions are local governments taking in response to some of the issues after this fire?
We have LA, the city of LA is considering another eviction moratorium. So individuals who can attest to economic impact from the fires would be able to not be evicted for about a year for non-payment of rent. Remember that a lot of COVID-19 renter protections lasted until the end of May in 2024. So a lot of people fear that this could signal the city is just willing to go on an eviction moratorium every time there's any kind of disaster or issue, which results in lots of unpaid rent. Because if you let rent go unpaid and accumulate for a year, that's just such a large number that you can't really pay it off. And the whole time that the owner of the property, often a mom and pop landlord, someone who has worked very hard to buy a small building, they're paying a mortgage on that building, they're paying rising property tax, there are a lot of other expenses involved, and suddenly they just have people who are not paying rent because the city has called for a, quote, rent holiday, as some owners have called it. That could lead to a lot of de-investment from Los Angeles and people in capital just fleeing the city. We've already seen that happen in response to the so-called mansion tax. That's a 5% transfer tax on property over $5 million. So we could really see things get worse for the LA real estate market investment when we actually need money to come in to rebuild the city.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.